It is a night in the winter of 1942, and you are the master of a freighter near the middle of the North Atlantic. You are 800 miles from the nearest friendly airfield in any direction, in the stretch of ocean the crews call the Black Pit, and you have just watched the tanker 2 columns overlift out of the water on a column of fire. There was no aircraft overhead. No warning came. Somewhere out in the dark, a German submarine is running on the surface at the speed of your whole convoy, picking which ship goes next, and there is nothing on the sea around you that can find it before it fires again. For 18 months, that was the arithmetic of the Atlantic. What broke? It came from an unlikely pair of machines. The first was a small aircraft carrier built on a merchant hull. Bolted to the bow of an escort sat the other, a squat cluster of 24 mortars called the Hedgehog. This is how the American hunter-killer group turned the convoy from prey into the bait in a trap, and how the Wolfpacks were driven off the North Atlantic for good in a single month. By the middle of 1942, the German submarine had become a weapon the Allies could not stop. How badly they were losing before the American answer arrived is what makes the story matter. The commander of the U-boat arm was Admiral Karl Dönitz. He had one idea. And the idea was working. He called it the tonnage war. He did not care which ships he sank or where he sank them. He cared only that the total tonnage sent to the bottom each month stayed higher than the tonnage the Allied shipyards could launch to replace it. Win that race and Britain starves whatever happens on land. His instrument was the Wolfpack. A single submarine that found a convoy held its fire. Shadowed. It radioed the convoy's course and speed back to headquarters in France. And Dönitz vectored a dozen more boats across the sea to gather ahead of the merchant ships in a patrol line. On the night he chose, they attacked together on the surface where their low hulls were nearly invisible and their diesel engines let them outrun the escorts. The numbers that year were catastrophic for the Allies. In June of 1942 alone, the U-boats sank about 830,000 tons of shipping. Across the whole year, more than 1,300 Allied ships went to the bottom of the Atlantic. Dönitz was winning his race. He knew it to the ton. Every sinking was a fact in a ledger he checked each morning. A merchant sailor's chance of surviving the war in that convoy run was worse than an infantryman's, and the men knew it. They slept in their clothes. They ate with life jackets on. In the engine rooms, the men furthest from a hatch understood exactly what a torpedo hit meant for them and stood their watches anyway. One convoy shows what that meant in ships and men. In the last days of October 1942, a slow eastbound convoy of about 40 ships, known as SC-17, left New York and was found off the southern coast of Newfoundland by a Wolfpack the Germans had named Violet. Over roughly a week of running battle, the boats sank 15 of those 40 ships, the heaviest loss any transatlantic convoy suffered that winter. Only when the convoy finally steamed within reach of land-based patrol aircraft did the attacks fall away and the pack draw off. That was the shape of the whole campaign in one crossing. Inside the reach of aircraft, the convoy was survivable, and outside it, in the Black Pit, the Wolfpack took whatever it wanted. The reason the Wolfpacks could work at all was a hole in the map, and the hole had a name. Land-based aircraft had already proven they could break up a Wolfpack. A submarine on the surface is fast and deadly, but a submarine forced to dive is slow and half-blind, out of the fight for hours. An aircraft overhead won just by appearing. It only had to force the boat under, because a submerged boat crawled along too slowly to keep up with the convoy and soon lost it. But the aircraft of 1942 could not fly far enough. From Newfoundland, from Iceland, from Northern Ireland, the patrol planes reached out a few hundred miles and then had to turn for home. In the center of the ocean there was a gap. Those wings could not close, a stretch of open water where no Allied aircraft ever appeared. The airmen called it the Mid-Atlantic Gap. The sailors called it the Black Pit. It mattered that the German boats fought this fight on the surface because on the surface they held the advantage that the whole convoy system could not overcome. The standard boat of the Wolfpack was the Type VII. On top of the water, it ran faster than a laden convoy could steam. At night, its long, low hull sat so flat against the sea that a lookout on a merchant ship would not see it until the torpedo was already running. It approached in the dark on its diesels and fired from inside the columns of ships. Then it turned away on the surface at a speed the escorts could not match. Diving was its escape only after the attack, when an escort came for it. In those years, the Wolfpack fought as a fast surface torpedo boat that could dip beneath the sea only when a hunter came for it, and in the Black Pit there was nothing overhead to make it dip under. Dönitz moved his Wolfpacks into it and hunted there without a single plane ever troubling him, and the convoys had to cross it with only their surface escorts for cover. The surface escorts had a weapon, and the weapon had a flaw that the U-boat commanders had learned to exploit. The escort found a submerged submarine by sound, by the ASDIC beam that pinged out through the water and echoed back off a steel hull. Once it had contact, it ran in to attack with depth charges. Drums of explosive rolled off the stern and over the side, set to burst at a chosen depth. Here was the flaw. The ASDIC beam pointed down and forward from the ship, and as the escort passed over the submarine, the beam lost the target. For the last long seconds of the run-in, the attacking ship was blind. It had to sprint over the spot where it guessed the boat was and drop its charges on a dead reckoning, on a memory of where the submarine had been half a minute earlier. A calm U-boat captain counted the seconds, waited for the escort to commit, and turned hard the moment he heard the propellers overhead. The depth charges burst in the water he had just left. Worse, each near miss churned the sea into a wall of noise and bubbles that blinded the ASDIC for as long as half an hour. By the time the water settled, the submarine was a mile away and gone, and the escorts spent whole nights attacking empty ocean. That was the situation the Americans set out to fix, and they fixed it with two things at once. The first was a way to carry aircraft into the Black Pit. If land planes could not reach the center of the ocean, then the airfield would have to sail there. Building fleet carriers took years the Allies did not have, So President Roosevelt pushed a crash program to do it the cheap and fast way. Take a merchant hull, a cargo ship, or a tanker already on the slipway, and finish it with a flat wooden deck, a single hangar, and 1 or 2 elevators. The result was small, slow, thin-skinned, and unlovely. The crews called them jeep carriers and baby flat tops, and the men who served on them never mistook one for a fleet carrier. But a jeep carrier could hold a dozen Avenger torpedo bombers and about 16 Wildcat fighters, and that was an airfield in the middle of the ocean, exactly where there had never been one before. The gap in the map could be closed by a ship that steamed into it. The genius of it was that they could be built by the dozen. The industrialist Henry Kaiser took the escort carrier the way his yards had taken the Liberty ship, breaking it into prefabricated sections welded together on an assembly line far from the sea. At his yard on the Columbia River in Vancouver, Washington, the Casablanca class rolled off the ways at a pace no carrier had ever matched. About 50 of them came in a little over a year, close to one a week. Each hull was finished in roughly 3 months. Dönitz was fighting a numbers war. The Americans answered his submarines with a better tactic and with a flood of small carriers he had never counted on. 5 of the roving hunter-killer groups that would prowl the Atlantic were built around escort carriers, and between them they accounted for more than 50 U-boats before the war ended. The second decision sent the escort carrier hunting instead of guarding. Early escort carriers sailed tied to a convoy, flying patrols in a defensive ring around the merchant ships, waiting for the U-boat to come to them. Then the Americans turned the idea inside out. Instead of guarding one convoy, an escort carrier and a handful of destroyers would form an independent group with no merchant ships to protect it all, and go looking for submarines to attack. This was the hunter-killer group. Its great advantage was intelligence. Every time a Wolfpack shadower radioed its long report back to France, Allied shore stations fixed the direction of the signal. They used the high-frequency direction finding sets the crews nicknamed Huff Duff. And Allied code breakers read enough of the traffic to know roughly where the boats were gathering. Before, that knowledge only told a convoy where to steer around the danger. Now it told a hunter-killer group where to steer toward it. The escort carrier launched its aircraft along the bearing of the intercept, and the Avengers went hunting the U-boats where they refueled and gathered hundreds of miles from any convoy at all. The aircraft could find a boat and force it under, but forcing it under was only half the job. To finish it, the escorts that steamed with the carrier needed a weapon that did not share the depth charge's blind spot. That weapon was the Hedgehog. A British scientist named Charles Goodaway had led its development, and the design was a direct answer to the flaw that had let so many U-boats escape. Instead of rolling charges off the stern after the ship had already passed over and lost contact, the Hedgehog threw its bombs forward, off the bow, out ahead of the ship, while the Aztec still held the target dead in its beam. It was the first ahead, thrown anti-submarine weapon in service, and that single change closed the gap in the attack that the U-boat captains had lived inside. The Hedgehog fired 24 small mortar bombs in a spread that fell into the sea in a ring about 250 yards ahead of the ship. Each bomb weighed about 65 pounds and carried a contact fuse, and this was the second piece of cleverness. A depth charge burst whether it was near the boat or not, and a miss blinded the ship's own sonar. A Hedgehog bomb did nothing at all unless it struck a hard surface, and the only hard surface down there was the hull of a submarine. A pattern that missed simply sank to the bottom in silence, and the Aztec never lost the target, so the escort could turn and attack again straight away and again until it did not miss. And when a bomb did strike, it struck against the pressure hull itself, not near it, and the boats sank faster than a man could believe. A Hedgehog bomb reached 200 feet in under 10 seconds, and a submarine's deep test depth of about 750 feet in a little over half a minute. 1 or 2 hits on the hull were usually enough to open it to the sea. The escort no longer had to guess where the boat would be. It struck where the boat was. The crews did not love the Hedgehog at first, and the reason says something about how men fight. A depth charge that missed still burst and still threw up a satisfying tower of water. It let a tired crew believe they had at least hurt the thing down there. A Hedgehog that missed made no sound and no splash of fire at all. The bombs simply vanished into the sea, and the men were left staring at flat water with nothing to show for the attack. Early on, only about 5 in every 100 Hedgehog attacks sank a boat, barely better than the depth charge. The low confidence fed on itself. The change came from training rather than from any change to the weapon. An officer from the British Development Group was sent to the escort base at Londonderry to teach the crews how to aim it and to walk them through the attacks that had worked. Once the men trusted the pattern and held their Aztec contact through the run, the numbers climbed and did not stop. By the end of the war, about 1 Hedgehog attack in 5 was sinking a submarine, against fewer than 1 in 80 for the depth charge. The weapon that made no reassuring noise had become the most lethal thing an escort could carry. Put the airfield and the ahead, thrown weapon together under one commander, feed them the bearings from Huff Duff, and the convoy stopped being the target. It became the bait. Now watch the trap close on a single night in the month the German Navy would remember as Black May. It is the 22nd of May, 1943, and you are flying an Avenger off the deck of the escort-carrier Bogue, somewhere in the North Atlantic that Dönitz still thinks is his. Below you, the ocean is empty in every direction. No convoy, no coast, only the group of ships that sent you up. You are here because the code breakers and the direction finders put a Wolfpack in this square of sea, and the Bogue's group has come to find it rather than run from it. Then you see it, the low, dark shape of U-569 on the surface. Type VII submarine running in the open, the way the boats had run in the open for 3 years without ever fearing the sky. The pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade William Chamberlain, pushes over into the attack. The boat crash dives. But an aircraft over a diving submarine is exactly the situation the U-boat men had no answer for. A second Avenger comes in behind the first. The attacks tear open the boat below the waterline, and her own crew, unable to run and unable to fight, scuttle her rather than go down trapped inside. It was the first submarine ever brought to its end by a task group built around an escort carrier. The airfield had sailed into the Black Pit, and the Black Pit was no longer safe. That single kill was one of dozens that month, and the month is the whole story. Through the spring, the Wolfpacks had still been savaging convoys, and as late as March of 1943, the U-boats had come close to cutting the Atlantic in two. Then the balance tipped. It tipped fast. In May of 1943, Allied forces sent 41 U-boats to the bottom. Dönitz, who had counted his tonnage so carefully for so long, now counted his own losses and called the total a frightful and unexpected blow. On the 24th of May, he did the thing he had sworn never to do. He ordered the Wolfpacks withdrawn from the North Atlantic altogether. In his memoirs, he wrote it plainly that Wolfpack operations against the convoys were no longer possible, that he had pulled the boats out on the 24th of May, and that they had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The man who had spent 3 years winning his race conceded it in a single sentence. For the men in the boats, the whole world had turned over. The submarine that had spent 3 years as the hunter of the Atlantic was now the hunted thing. Its crews felt the change first. A boat on the surface to charge its batteries could no longer count on an empty sky. A boat gathered with others to refuel could no longer count on empty water. Dönitz saw where it led as clearly as anyone. He judged that to keep the campaign going in the face of losses like May's would mean casualties rising to an appalling height and, in his own words, certain and deliberate self-sacrifice by the crews. He had asked his men to sink ships. He would not yet ask them to die for no return, and so he pulled them back. The Wolfpack tactic that had defined the Atlantic for 3 years was finished, and the ocean the boats had owned was closed to them. The kills went on where the U-boats fled to, and the hunter-killer groups followed them there. After the Wolfpacks left the convoy routes, the boats still at sea depended on a small number of large supply submarines. These were the Type 14 tankers the crews called milk cows. They carried the fuel and torpedoes that let an ordinary boat stay on patrol for weeks longer. Sink a milk cow and you did more than end one submarine. You cut short the patrols of every boat that would have drunk from it. The escort carrier Card under Captain Arnold Isbell went hunting exactly those. On the 4th of October 1943, an Avenger flown by Lieutenant Robert Stearns off the Card caught the milk cow U-460 on the surface north of the Azores in the act of refueling other boats. She had resupplied 86 U-boats across her career, and she went down there with most of her crew. Isbell's group destroyed 8 submarines in a single deployment, hundreds of miles from any convoy, hunting the enemy in the open ocean, the way the enemy had once hunted the merchant ships. One night in that same campaign shows how close the fighting could get once the hunters had the initiative. On the last night of October 1943, one of the Card's old destroyers, the Bory, under Lieutenant Charles Hutchins, ran down a U-boat on the surface in a rising gale north of the Azores. Hutchins gave the order that no destroyer captain expected to give in the modern age, stand by for a ram, and drove his bow at the submarine. A heavy sea lifted the Bogue and dropped her across the deck of U-405, and for long minutes the two ships were locked together, grinding in the swell too close for the destroyer's main guns to bear. The crews fought with whatever they could reach across the few feet of water between them, small arms and even shell cases hurled by hand, until the sea finally pulled the ships apart and the submarine went down. The Bogue herself was so badly holed by the collision that she could not be saved, and her crew scuttled her the next day. It was a fight decided by ramming and close-range fire, the kind of action naval officers thought belonged to another century, and it happened because the American group had chased a Wolfpack boat into a corner it could not escape. What the Hedgehog itself could do in the right hands was shown most clearly a little later and on the far side of the world, and it is worth the honesty to say so, because the weapon was never only an Atlantic story. In the Pacific, a single American destroyer escort named the England, under Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton, went after Japanese submarines with her Hedgehog and sank 6 of them in 12 days in the spring of 1944. 6 submarines to 1 small ship. All of it inside 12 days. That record has never been matched. The ahead-thrown weapon that kept its sonar contact through the whole attack had turned the hardest target in naval warfare into something a modest escort could kill again and again on the same yacht. The Germans had built the tonnage war on the belief that a submerged submarine was almost impossible to destroy. The Hedgehog made that belief false. Behind the weapons stood the other reversal, the one Dönitz had watched creep up on him from the start. His entire strategy rested on sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them, and by the middle of 1943, the Allies were building them faster than he could sink them. American yards launched more than 1,100 Liberty ships in 1943 alone, welded together from prefabricated sections in a matter of days each. From July of that year, the tonnage the Allied shipyards put into the water each month finally and permanently overtook the tonnage the U-boats could send to the bottom. Dönitz had lost the race he had chosen to run, and he had lost it in the same season his Wolfpacks were driven off the sea. The convoy that had crossed the Black Pit in terror in the winter of 1942 now crossed it under a canopy of carrier aircraft, with hunter-killer groups roaming ahead, and reached England with its cargo intact. The surface escorts had come into their own as well, and one convoy battle earlier that same May shows why. The convoy, called ONS-5, guarded by a British escort group under Captain Peter Gretton, was set upon by more than 30 U-boats in a running fight of several days. The old arithmetic said the Wolfpack would win. Instead, the escorts held. By the end of the battle, they had destroyed 6 U-boats while losing far fewer merchant ships than the size of the pack should have cost. That fight is often marked as the moment the advantage passed for good to the men guarding the convoys. Taken together with the escort carriers offshore and the Hedgehog on the bow, it meant a Wolfpack could no longer gather around a convoy without paying a price it could not afford. So the reversal was total, and it can be measured in the one currency Dönitz respected. For 3 years, the German submarine had owned the middle of the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, and hunting from inside a gap no aircraft could reach. The American answer worked by taking away the two things the U-boat had depended on, rather than by outgunning it. the escort carrier sailed an airfield into the gap and erased the safe water. The Hedgehog took away the last blind second in the attack and made the submerged boat killable. The convoy stopped being the prey and became the bait, and the hunter-killer group closed around the hunter. In a single month, the Wolfpacks were pulled off the North Atlantic, and the man who had run the tonnage war wrote in his own hand that the battle was lost. If you served aboard one of the jeep carriers, or crewed a destroyer escort with a Hedgehog on her bow, or crossed the Black Pit on a merchant ship and made it home, tell us the name of your ship in the comments. And tell us which pairing you want next, the feared German weapon and the American answer that ended its run, and we will take you there.